Hello. I always believed that if betrayal ever knocked on my door, I wouldn't be the kind of man who collapsed under the weight of it. No messy breakdowns, no pathetic begging, no overdramatic screaming matches. Just cold, surgical precision. And as I stood in our home office, flipping through the neatly arranged pages of my wife's so-called business itinerary, I realized that today was the day I would prove it. It wasn't suspicion that led me here. I had no gnawing doubt, no gut feeling that something was off. It was just the sheer absurdity of how sloppy she had become. A woman who used to remember the exact date we bought our first couch had suddenly forgotten our anniversary. A woman who lectured me about emotional intelligence and clear communication was now making absurd excuses for coming home late, looking rattled and distracted. A woman who prided herself on control, order, and meticulous planning had, against all logic, left a paper trail leading straight to her downfall. The itinerary in my hands was supposed to detail her client meetings for the month. I was the one who had printed it as a favor because her assistant was out sick. I even proofread it. But something about it gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way she barely glanced at the final copy when I handed it to her. Maybe it was the way she kept her phone tilted away from me, as if it contained nuclear secrets instead of mundane work messages. Maybe it was nothing at all, just the simple fact that, deep down, I had stopped trusting her without even realizing it. So, I did something I had never done before. I kept a copy. And today, on a random Thursday afternoon, I decided to cross-check her movements with reality. Not because I was emotional. Not because I was afraid, but because if my wife was playing me for a fool, I needed to be absolutely sure before I dismantled her entire world. I opened her laptop, our shared device, the one she foolishly assumed I never touched, and searched for flight confirmations. There it was. The name of the city matched her itinerary, but the dates didn't. Her itinerary claimed she was flying out on Monday morning for a 3-day client summit. The airline ticket? Booked for Sunday night. Returning not Wednesday, but Saturday. A 5-day trip, not 3. And that's when the first piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I kept digging, checked her work email, scanned through the forwarded reservations. The hotel listed wasn't the one the company usually booked for her. In fact, it wasn't even a corporate preferred location. It was, how poetic, a luxury boutique hotel known for its romantic getaway packages. And that's when I knew. Most men, at this point, would panic. Maybe I was supposed to feel some grand wave of heartbreak, some earth-shattering moment of grief. But all I felt was something closer to amusement. This is the best she could do? A woman who built her entire identity around being smarter than everyone else had just left me a breadcrumb trail so blatant, it was almost insulting. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled slowly. All right. Now what? Confront her? Too easy. Too predictable. She'd cry, she'd lie, she'd manipulate, and by the time the dust settled, she'd twisted into some narrative where I was the villain for not trusting her enough. No, she didn't deserve the luxury of a confrontation. Divorce? That was coming. But not yet. Not without precision. Not without making sure she felt the exact level of devastation she had so carelessly plotted for me. I swirled the idea around in my head, savoring it like a fine whiskey. What would hurt her the most? And then, it clicked. Her reputation. My wife wasn't just anyone. She came from a long line of well-respected, high-society elites. A family obsessed with image, honor, and legacy. They weren't just wealthy, they were old-money wealthy, the kind that looked down on new-money entrepreneurs like me despite happily enjoying the financial perks I brought into their daughter's life. A scandal wouldn't just be embarrassing for her, it would be unforgivable. She had always loved playing the perfect wife in public. The graceful, sophisticated woman with an unshakable reputation. She basked in admiration and whispered envy from other women. And that was her Achilles heel. Destroying our marriage wouldn't faze her much. Women like her had contingency plans. But destroying her carefully curated public image? That was a wound she would never recover from. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found exactly who I needed. A journalist friend who owed me a favor. A man who, just last year, had called me in a panic when his wife was being dragged through a social media scandal. I had helped him silence the noise, kill the rumors, control the narrative. Now, it was his turn to return the favor. I tapped out a message. Got a story for you. High profile. Exclusive. Scandalous. Interested. Within seconds, he replied. Always. I smirked. This wasn't about rage. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of my ego. This was about teaching a lesson. A lesson in consequences. A lesson in what happens when you gamble everything and lose. She thought she was clever, thought she was untouchable. She had no idea the avalanche that was about to bury her alive. People always say that when you look back, the signs were there all along. That if you replay the past enough times, you'll start to see the cracks forming, the little inconsistencies, the moments that didn't quite add up. But that's a lie. Because if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you that my life was solid. Not perfect, but steady, dependable. The kind of life a man works his entire existence to build, only to realize too late that the foundation was made of sand. Mira and I had been married for 8 years. Not long enough to be called an old married couple, but long enough to have a rhythm, a system. We had our routines: Sunday brunch at our favorite cafe, Wednesday night movie marathons, lazy Saturday mornings where I'd wake up first, make coffee, and bring it to her in bed while she mumbled something half-coherent about 5 more minutes. We weren't one of those passionate, dramatic couples who thrived on chaos, but that's what I loved about us. We were stable. We were safe. Or at least, that's what I thought. Looking back, there were moments. Not alarms, not sirens. Just small, insignificant details that, at the time, I brushed off as normal shifts in a long-term relationship. She started wearing perfume before she left for work, which I found flattering. She was spending longer on her hair, taking a little more care in how she dressed. I thought maybe it was just part of getting older, wanting to feel attractive. And why wouldn't she? She was beautiful, always had been. Elegant, effortless in a way that made people gravitate toward her. Then there were the changes in conversation. We used to talk about everything. I knew her office politics, her friends' drama, even the random thoughts that popped into her head throughout the day. But somewhere along the way, our conversations started feeling edited. She still spoke to me, still asked about my day, still laughed at my jokes, but it felt thinner, like she was rationing her words, giving me just enough to keep me from noticing she was holding something back. She used to leave her phone anywhere, on the kitchen counter, on the couch, plugged into the charger by the bed. Then one day, she started keeping it face down. Another time, I walked into the room, and she turned the screen away from me just a little too quickly. Small, meaningless things. If I had asked her about it, she probably would have laughed and called me paranoid. And maybe I would have believed her. But back then, I didn't ask. Because I trusted her. We had built a life together. A house that felt like home, not just a place we lived. Our friends were intertwined. Our schedules seamlessly connected. We had jokes no one else understood. Memories layered so deeply they felt like part of my DNA. I knew which songs made her cry, which foods she secretly hated but pretended to enjoy because I liked them. She knew when I was stressed without me saying a word. Knew how to defuse my worst moods with a single touch. There was no grand discontent, no explosive fights. Just comfort. And yet, there were shifts. The first time she forgot to tell me about an out-of-town work trip, I barely reacted. She called me from the airport, all rushed apologies and last-minute excuses about how it had slipped her mind. I laughed it off. What kind of husband gets upset over a scheduling mistake? The second time, she mentioned it casually over dinner, as if it had been planned all along, as if she had told me weeks ago. And maybe she had. Maybe I was the one forgetting. Maybe I was being unreasonable. Or maybe she was testing how much she could get away with. I remember a night, 3 months before I found out. We were at a charity gala, the kind of event Mira loved. She looked stunning, of course, draped in some designer dress she had been thrilled to wear. She was always good at these things, knowing who to talk to, how to charm the right people, how to make herself unforgettable without looking like she was trying. And that night, as I watched her from across the room, I remember thinking, she's slipping away. Not physically. She was right there, smiling, laughing, running a hand through her hair the way she always did when she was amused. But I felt it, a distance I couldn't explain, something just beyond my reach. I told myself it was in my head. That marriage wasn't about always feeling connected, that there would be phases where we felt slightly out of sync. I had no idea that while I was standing there, admiring my wife, she was already someone else's. But the cruelest thing? If I had never found out, if she had been just a little smarter, just a little more careful, I probably would have lived the rest of my life believing we were happy. That's what betrayal really is. It's not just about the moment of discovery. It's about realizing that for weeks, months, maybe even years, you were the only one in the relationship. That every memory you thought was sacred, every inside joke, Every shared glance across a crowded room wasn't real for her anymore. And yet, despite all of that, despite the slow erosion of trust that had been happening right under my nose, the moment I finally uncovered the truth, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel loss. I felt clarity. Because the second I knew for certain, the second I saw it all laid out in front of me, her false itinerary, her hidden flight bookings, the romantic hotel that had nothing to do with business, the last illusion shattered. And in its place, there was only one thought. It's time to take everything from her. It started with a phone call. Nothing dramatic, no hushed whispers or sudden silences. Just a moment, one insignificant moment that stuck in my mind like a splinter. We were sitting on the couch, halfway through a movie neither of us was really watching, when her phone buzzed. Not unusual. Myra's phone was always buzzing. Work emails, group chats, social invitations she pretended to care about. But this time, when she picked it up, something shifted. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the screen for a second too long, fingers hovering just slightly before she hit decline. Then, as if remembering I was sitting right next to her, she casually turned the phone face down on the cushion beside her. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except for what happened next. Who was it? I asked, not really expecting anything. Mira stretched, yawned like she was bored, and gave a dismissive wave. Spam, I think. Or one of those work calls I don't feel like dealing with. A perfectly reasonable answer. Except the second she said it, her phone lit up again. Same caller. And this time, she snatched it up and stood. Ugh, give me a second, she muttered, already walking toward the kitchen. I need to tell them to stop calling. That was the moment. A tiny flicker of something off. I sat there, staring at the paused screen of the movie, listening as she disappeared into the other room. She didn't answer the call. I could hear the faint tap of her fingers on the screen, probably sending a text. Then silence. A full minute passed before she came back, smiling like nothing had happened. Handled, she said, plopping down beside me and nudging my leg with her foot. What did I miss? I forced a smirk. Not much. The murderer is still murdering. She laughed, but I wasn't really paying attention to the movie anymore. My focus was on her phone, now sitting screen down again, as if it had always been that way. Something didn't feel right. I could have let it go. A lot of men would have. A call at an odd hour? A little secrecy? Not exactly damning evidence. But I've built my entire career on one simple rule: small details matter. You don't ignore them just because they don't fit a pattern yet. You watch. You wait. You collect the pieces until they form a picture. So I started paying attention. At first, it was subtle. A shift in the way she moved through our home, like she was suddenly hyper-aware of herself. Her phone, which used to be just another object in our space, became an extension of her. If I walked into the room while she was on it, she'd end the call quickly, mid-sentence, with a vague, "I'll talk to you later," before setting it down and flashing me a smile. I started testing it. If I made a move toward her phone, just reaching over to grab something nearby, she'd tense, just for a second. If we were watching TV and I absent-mindedly rested my hand near it, she'd casually slide it away, acting like it was nothing. But the real giveaway? The lies. Small, stupid lies. One evening, she came home late, hair slightly tousled, a faint flush on her cheeks. Not suspicious by itself, until I asked how her day was. "Oh, the usual," she said breezily, kicking off her heels. "Meetings, emails, spreadsheets. You know how it is." I just nodded. I didn't know how it was. That was the problem. Because earlier that afternoon, I had called her office, just to confirm a dinner reservation we had with one of her colleagues later that week. And her assistant, without hesitation, had told me. "Oh, Mira left around 2 today. Said she had a personal errand to run." 2. And yet, here she was, for hours later, pretending she had been buried in meetings all day. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Because a smart man doesn't ask for the truth. He collects it. He lets the liar keep lying, weaving a web so tangled they eventually trap themselves in it. Instead, I played my role perfectly. The trusting husband. The man who saw nothing, suspected nothing. I smiled at the right moments, kissed her goodnight, asked about her work as if I still believed her answers. But inside, I was already making calculations. If she was lying about small things, what else was she lying about? And more importantly, who was on the other end of that phone? I stopped believing in coincidences the moment I saw the patterned small details lining up like dominoes waiting for the final push. Her phone calls, the sudden tension. There's a moment when suspicion hardens into certainty, when the little inconsistencies stop being random and start forming a pattern, when you realize you're not just being paranoid, you're being played, and once you cross that line, there's no going back, because now it's not about trust or love or second chances, it's about truth, and I was going to get it no matter what. I didn't accuse her, I didn't ask questions, I didn't give her any reason to think I was onto her, because that would be stupid. No, instead, I did what she was doing. I played along, I smiled, I kissed her goodnight, I acted like nothing had changed, but behind that mask I was watching everything, analyzing every move, every word, every reaction, because if she thought she was the only one who could lie, she was about to learn a hard lesson. The first thing I noticed was the passwords. She had never been secretive about them before. We shared everything, or at least I thought we did, but suddenly her phone had a new lock code. Her laptop required a password it never had before. Even her email was different. And when I casually asked, "Oh, hey, I think I forgot your phone code. Can you unlock it for me?" she hesitated just for a second before laughing it off, saying, "Oh, I changed it for security. Work's been cracking down on privacy." I nodded, smiled, made a joke about the corporate overlords spying on us, but inside I was making a mental note that was the first crack. Then there were the lies, not big ones, not yet, but small ones meant to keep me off balance. The time she told me she was stuck in a late meeting, but I checked the company calendar, and there were no scheduled meetings past 4. The time she said she went out for drinks with co-workers, but her usual group had all posted pictures from a different bar miles away from where she claimed to be. The time she came home saying she was exhausted from work, but she smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. Something floral and sharp, something meant to impress. I started testing her, setting little traps to see how she'd react. One night, I casually mentioned, "Oh, I ran into Sarah today." She said, "You left early again?" Mira barely blinked. "Oh yeah, I had an off-site meeting, no big deal." But there was no off-site meeting. I knew that I had checked, and that was when I knew she wasn't just lying. She was confident about it, like she had done it so many times before that it didn't even require effort, and that realization was what flipped the switch in my head from maybe I'm wrong to I am absolutely right. So I started digging, not out in the open, not yet, but in the quiet spaces between our interactions, when she was in the shower, when she left her laptop unattended, when she was asleep. Because here's the thing about cheaters, they always think they're smart, but they always make mistakes, and Myra's mistake was thinking I wasn't paying attention. She had a second email, one that wasn't linked to any of our shared accounts, one that she probably thought I'd never find, but I did, and the moment I opened it I knew I had her, because inside were flight confirmations for a trip she had never mentioned, hotel reservations under a fake company name, text notifications from a number that wasn't saved in her contacts but was very clearly someone important, someone she was careful about, someone she was hiding. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling not anger, not sadness, but something colder, something sharper, the kind of clarity that comes when you realize the game has already started and you're just now learning the rules. She had been playing for months, maybe longer, and now it was my turn to play. So I started collecting everything, every lie, every inconsistency, every message she thought was deleted but wasn't, every calendar entry that didn't match up with reality, every late-night excuse, every slip of the tongue, because I wasn't going to confront her with just suspicions, no, that would give her room to deny, twist, manipulate. Instead, I was going to build something so airtight, so undeniable, that when the moment came to strike, she wouldn't just be caught, she'd be completely destroyed. And the best part was she had no idea. She still looked at me like I was the same man she had married, still kissed me goodbye in the morning, still curled up next to me at night, completely unaware that every day that passed brought her closer to the end of the life she thought she had so carefully constructed. She thought she was in control. She had no idea she was already losing. It was worse than I thought, not just an affair, not just a mistake, but a full-blown second life neatly hidden behind business trips and overtime and last-minute meetings. I found out on a random Thursday morning, not because I was looking, but because fate or karma or whatever force governs justice decided that today was the day Myra's carefully constructed lie call lapsed in on itself. I was in our home office going through emails when her laptop pinged a notification. I wasn't even trying to snoop, it was just there staring at me, daring me to look, and I did, because at this point I already knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how deep the rot went. It was a message, a simple one from an unsaved number, but I recognized the tone immediately. Urgent, eager, dangerous. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you, and can we meet again? I sat there staring at the words, not because I was surprised, but because of how stupidly bold she had become. She hadn't even bothered to delete it, hadn't even considered that I might see it. It was almost insulting, and for a second, just a second, I felt something close to admiration for how completely she had fooled me, for how long she had kept this hidden. Then that second passed, and all I felt was cold clarity. I clicked on the message thread. There was more, so much more text going back months, photos, nothing explicit, but worse in a way, little snapshots of their secret world, a table for two at a rooftop bar, the corner of a hotel room, an inside joke exchanged over dinner, a bottle of wine with the caption, thinking of you. I kept scrolling until I found it, the proof that changed everything. A reservation confirmation, of fancy boutique hotel under her name, booked weeks ago for two guests. I checked the dates. They matched one of her supposed work trips, the one where she left on a Sunday night instead of Monday, the one where she came back glowing. That was it, the last puzzle piece snapping into place. There was no doubt anymore, no room for excuses or explanations or gaslighting me into thinking I was imagining things. She was cheating, not casually, not impulsively, but methodically, with planning, with effort, with someone she cared about enough to build an entire secret world around, and that's what made my blood run cold. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated betrayal. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, no shaking, no panic, just a steady heartbeat as I let it all settle in, the truth, the scope, the sheer audacity of it, because I wasn't broken by this. I wasn't going to crumble into some pathetic wreck crying about how I didn't see it coming. I did see it coming. I had just been too patient, too calculated, too trusting, but now trust was off the table. Now it was time for retribution. I copied everything, every message, every photo, every receipt, forwarded it all to myself, locked it away in a folder labeled Final Act. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, an old friend, a journalist, someone who owed me a favor. When he picked up, I didn't bother with pleasantries, just said, I have a story for you, and you're going to want to hear it. Because Mira had built her entire identity on being untouchable, on being perfect, the devoted wife, the respected professional, the woman everyone admired, and now I had everything I needed to rip that mask off in front of the world, to make sure everyone saw her for what she really was. She thought she had the upper hand, she thought she was playing me, but she had no idea that the game had just changed, and this time I was the one holding all the cards. I sat in silence for a long time, not out of shock, not out of grief, but because I was calculating, turning the situation over in my mind like a puzzle, shifting the pieces until the image became clear. Revenge wasn't just about payback, it wasn't about rage or some petty emotional outburst. No, if I was going to do this, it had to be precise, it had to hit her where she would feel it the most, not just today, not just tomorrow, but for a lifetime. Myra's weakness wasn't money. She would recover from financial ruin. Her career wasn't her identity. She could always rebuild professionally. No, her real weakness, her true Achilles heel, was her reputation, the image she spent years curating, the flawless persona she projected to the world, the admiration she thrived on, the respect, the envy, the social currency she had meticulously cultivated. For as long as I had known her, Mira wasn't just a woman, she was a brand, and I was about to burn it to the ground. The first step was setting the stage. Revenge isn't just about striking, it's about timing. If I went too soon, she'd scramble, spin a narrative twisted in her favor. No, I had to make sure there was nowhere to run, so I kept playing the role of the trusting husband, watching, waiting, pretending until I had everything in place. While she laughed with her friends, attended her charity galas, sat in high-end restaurants thinking she was untouchable, I was building the trap around her. I reached out to key people in her circle, friends, colleagues, old contacts of mine. I started planting seeds, little doubts, small whispers, carefully phrased questions that made people start looking at her differently. I didn't outright accuse her of anything that would be too obvious. Instead, I became the concerned husband, the man who loved his wife but noticed she was acting strangely distant, preoccupied, stressed. I let them connect the dots on their own, and they did, because people love a scandal, they just need permission to talk about it. Next was the professional angle. Mira thrived in high society circles with a spotless reputation, but she had one vulnerability: a pending business deal, a partnership that would elevate her status even higher, a deal that relied on her image being untarnished. So I made sure certain emails found their way to the right inboxes, carefully crafted messages, anonymous tips, not exposing her outright, but raising just enough suspicion that her partners started asking questions. Suddenly, she wasn't a safe bet anymore. Suddenly, there was doubt. Then came the personal strike. I knew her lover now. I had his name, his job, his family situation, a married man with kids, someone who had just as much to lose as she did, and I used that because the best way to collapse an affair is to turn the participants against each other. I let him know that I knew, not directly, but through an untraceable message, one that hinted at exposure, one that made it clear he was in danger. Men like him panic quickly, men like him don't think rationally under pressure, and sure enough, he started pulling away. Suddenly, Mira wasn't a thrilling escape, she was a liability. She noticed, she panicked, she tried to reach out to him more and more, while I watched, knowing that soon enough she would be left completely alone. And finally, the public execution. I waited until the perfect moment, until she was at the height of her arrogance, smiling, confident, basking in the illusion that she was still in control. It was an event, a fundraiser, something filled with the right people, the People who mattered to her more than anyone else, her family, her colleagues, the influential names she craved validation from, and right when she was in the spotlight, right when she felt untouchable, I struck. It wasn't messy, it wasn't loud, it was surgical. A discreet package delivered to key individuals, a series of emails scheduled to go out at the exact right moment, photographs, hotel confirmations, receipts, messages compiled into a neat, devastating truth that spread through the room like wildfire. Whispers turned to gasps, turned to stunned silence, turned to her realizing too late that she had just been erased. She wasn't just exposed, she was humiliated, not just as a cheater, but as a fraud. Her carefully crafted image shattered, her social standing obliterated, her professional connections crumbling under the weight of the scandal. She wasn't even given the dignity of defending herself because the evidence spoke louder than she ever could. And I stood there watching as her world collapsed around her, calm, unshaken, victorious, because this wasn't revenge driven by emotion, this was justice meticulously planned, flawlessly executed. And as she turned to look at me, eyes wide in horror and disbelief in defeat, I simply smiled because she finally understood she never had the upper hand. I did all along. The beauty of a perfect trap is that the prey never sees it coming until it's too late, and that was exactly how I designed it. Mira had no idea she was walking straight into her own downfall. She still believed she was untouchable, still thought she was smarter than everyone else, including me, and that was her greatest weakness, her arrogance, her unwavering belief that no one could take her down. But that's the thing about illusions, they only last until reality rips them apart. I chose the event carefully, a high-profile fundraiser, one of those elegant black-tie gatherings where reputations were built and destroyed in the same breath. Mira thrived in these environments. She loved the attention, the admiration, the whispered envy from other women, the way men gravitated toward her effortless charm. She thought this night would be another victory, another moment where she shined, while I played the supportive husband standing dutiful at her side. But in reality, this night was the stage I had built for her public execution. The timing had to be perfect too early, and she might find a way to recover too late, and the damage wouldn't be instantaneous. No, it had to happen when she was at the peak of her confidence, when she was surrounded by the very people she wanted to impress the most. That's why I waited until the dinner had started, until the speeches were being made, until Mira was seated at the main table, smiling, laughing, playing the part of the perfect wife, the successful woman, the one everyone admired. And then I struck. It started with whispers, a few people checking their phones, glancing in her direction, confused, intrigued, then the ripple effect growing, spreading as more people received the same messages, the same damning truth. At first she didn't notice, too wrapped up in her conversation, too absorbed in her own self-importance, but then the room shifted, a strange quiet overtook the murmurs, and she felt it, sensed the eyes turning toward her, the judgment creeping in. Her phone buzzed, she checked it, frowned slightly, her perfectly rehearsed expression faltering for just a second before she turned to look at me, and that was the moment she knew something was wrong, because I wasn't looking at her with love or concern, I was looking at her with absolute certainty. She reached for my hand instinctively, a reflex like a drowning person grasping at anything to stay afloat, but I didn't move, I just watched as the realization settled into her bones, heavy, suffocating. Then the final blow. A waiter stepped forward, polite, professional, handing her an envelope, a simple white envelope, nothing dramatic, nothing overtly theatrical. But when she opened it, when she saw what was inside, her entire body went still, because there in her hands were the undeniable truths, printed copies of her messages with her lover, the hotel receipts, the photographs, the timeline of her betrayal laid out in cold, indisputable ink. She sucked in a sharp breath, eyes darting around the room, trying to gauge the damage, trying to see who had already seen it, and the answer was everyone. Her parents, who had spent years boasting about their daughter's flawless marriage, her colleagues who respected her polished professionalism, her closest friends who thought they knew everything about her, even the man she had been sleeping with, whose face had gone pale across the room, because his wife was sitting right beside him, and she too had just received her own copy of the truth. Mira tried to speak, but what could she say? There was no lie, no excuse that could undo this, no charming spin that could rewrite reality. The weight of it crushed her visibly. For the first time in her life, she had no control. And I just sat back and watched as the whispers turned to outright stares, as the air thickened with quiet condemnation, as the walls of her perfect world collapsed around her. Because this wasn't just exposure, this was social annihilation, carefully crafted, precisely delivered, with no escape. She turned back to me, eyes wild, desperate, as if begging for a way out. But I wasn't her savior, not anymore. I leaned in just slightly, just enough for her to hear me over the deafening silence, and said, "Checkmate." Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, gave a small, polite nod to the table, and walked out, leaving her to drown in the wreckage she had created. Myra's face was frozen in a perfect mask of shock, her fingers clenched around the damning papers like they might somehow disintegrate if she held them tight enough, her breath shallow, her eyes darting wildly across the room as the weight of it all crashed down around her. This wasn't just embarrassment, it wasn't just a mistake caught in the open, it was destruction, swift, merciless, and absolute, and I watched it happen with the same detached curiosity one might have watching a fire consume something rotten that should have burned long ago. She opened her mouth once, twice, nothing came out. She was scrambling, searching for words, for a way to make this disappear the way she had always been able to manipulate, control, twist reality into whatever suited her best. But there was nothing left to twist. The evidence was there, undeniable, unshakable, and worse, there were witnesses everywhere. The entire ballroom was silent, the kind of suffocating silence that only comes when something truly scandalous unfolds in real time. I saw her father's face go pale, saw her mother's lips pressed together in tight disapproval, saw the whispers beginning like slow-moving cracks in glass spreading outward until soon enough the whole structure would shatter. Finally she found her voice, but it was small, uncertain, and that alone told me everything, because Mira was never uncertain, not until now, not until she realized there was no script, no carefully rehearsed explanation that could save her. This isn't what it looks like. She tried, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow, weak, desperate. I said nothing, just stared at her with the same calm, unshaken presence I had maintained from the beginning, because I had learned something important in all of this. Silence is more powerful than shouting. Silence makes them crumble faster than rage ever could. Her hands trembled, now crumpling the papers slightly, as she turned frantically toward her father. Dad, it's not. This is all just a mistake, someone's trying to. But he was already shaking his head, disappointment carved into every line of his face. Her mother turned away, unable to even look at her. Panic flared in Myra's eyes, because this was what she truly feared, not losing me, not even the affair being exposed, but losing the image she had worked so hard to maintain, the adoration, the admiration, the respect of the people. She needed to see her as perfect. She turned back to me, eyes wide, glistening now as she reached for my arm. Please, we can talk about this, right? Whatever you think you saw, it's not. I took a step back, avoiding her touch, letting the space between us become a canyon one she could never cross again. Don't, I said evenly, and that single word broke her, because she knew there was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage. Tears welled in her eyes, now real ones, not the kind she had used in the past to manipulate situations in her favor, but the kind that came from true fear, true loss. She wasn't crying because she regretted what she had done. She was crying because for the first time in her life she had no way out. I let the silence drag, let the moment stretch into something unbearable for her, because that's exactly what she deserved, to sit in the mess she had created, to feel the walls closing in on her the way they had for me when I first found out, to experience the exact helplessness she had forced upon me, but worse, because she had done it to herself. Mira, I said finally, voice calm, steady, but cold. You lied to me, you betrayed me, and now you're facing the consequences. This isn't a misunderstanding, this isn't something you can explain away. It's over, and you have no one to blame but yourself. A quiet sob broke from her lips. She shook her head, her makeup smudged, her perfect image crumbling before everyone's eyes. No, we can fix this. I made a mistake, but you can't just. But I can. I cut her off, voice sharp, final. I can, and I will. She reached for me again, desperation bleeding into every movement, but I was already turning away, leaving her standing there, shattered, broken, humiliated, in front of the very people whose approval she had spent a lifetime chasing. And that was the real punishment, not just losing me, not just the exposure, but the fact that she would never be seen the same way again. The people who once admired her now saw her for what she really was, and that was a truth she would never be able to escape. Myra's fall wasn't instant, it wasn't a single moment of collapse, but a slow, agonizing unraveling that stretched out over weeks, every day peeling back another layer of the life she had so carefully built, until there was nothing left but wreckage and regret. She tried. Of course, she tried to contain it, to salvage what she could, but you can't unburn a house once the flames have taken hold, and I had made sure the fire spread to every corner of her world. Her family was the first to abandon her. Her father, a man who valued reputation above all else, was furious, not just about the affair, but about the public nature of her disgrace. Her mother refused to speak to her outright, turning away every time Mira tried to explain. Not that there was anything left to explain. Their perfect daughter, the shining example they had always paraded in front of others, had proven to be a fraud, and in their world that was unforgivable. They didn't care that she had lost her marriage. They didn't even care about her emotional state. They only cared that she had embarrassed them, and for people like them that was enough to cut her off completely. Her social circle evaporated overnight. The people who once gossiped with her were now gossiping about her. She tried to reach out, tried to tell her side of the story, but no one wanted to be associated with the scandal. No one wanted to risk their own reputations being tainted by her disaster. The invitations stopped, the friendly messages vanished. She was left watching from the outside as the world she once controlled moved on without her. Her career took the hardest hit. The business deal she had been working on, the one that would have cemented her status professionally, fell through completely. The partners pulled out quietly, issuing a vague statement about concerns over character alignment, which was just corporate speak for "we don't trust you anymore." Her company didn't fire her immediately, but they started distancing themselves, restructuring her role, removing her from high-profile projects, until eventually she was left with nothing but meaningless busy work and an unspoken understanding that it was only a matter of time before she was pushed out completely. She had built her career on her flawless reputation, and now that reputation was in shambles. But the worst part for Mira, the part that broke her, wasn't the loss of money or status, it was the loss of control. She had spent years crafting an image of perfection, manipulating every situation to her advantage, and now no one believed a word she said. No one cared about her explanations. She had lost her voice, and for a woman like her, that was the cruelest punishment of all. And me, I walked away clean, untouched by the disaster I had orchestrated. I had already moved the finances in my favor before everything went public. I had secured what I needed, and when I finally filed for divorce, she didn't even have the energy to fight. She signed the papers quickly, quietly, as if hoping that by severing ties with me she could somehow stop the bleeding, but it was too late for that. The damage was already done. I moved on easily, effortlessly, because that's the difference between us. I didn't need to control people. I didn't need validation to survive. I had always been strong with or without her, and once the dust settled, once the last remnants of our marriage were officially dissolved, I stood exactly where I had always planned, at the top, still standing, still winning. And Mira, she was left with nothing but the ruin of everything. She once was no longer admired, no longer respected, no longer anything but a cautionary tale whispered about behind closed doors. And that was the real victory. Not just that I exposed her, not just that I destroyed her, but that I made sure she would spend the rest of her life knowing that she was the architect of her own downfall, knowing that she had tried to play me, and in the end, I was the one who played her. In the end, Mira didn't beg, she didn't scream, she didn't try to twist the story into something that made her the victim, because she knew it wouldn't work. No amount of manipulation could undo what had been done. No clever words could erase the proof, the whispers, the shattered reputation she had spent years crafting. She understood that now, too late, far too late, and that was the best part of it all, watching her come to terms with the inescapable truth. She lost because she underestimated me. She thought I would crumble, that I would rage, that I would fight, and give her the perfect excuse to turn this into a messy divorce, a story where she could paint me as bitter, controlling, unstable. But I didn't give her that. I gave her silence, precision, the kind of cold, calculated retribution that left no room for retaliation. The last time I saw her was in the lawyer's office, the divorce papers between us, her hand shaking slightly as she signed them. It wasn't the loss of the marriage that made her hesitate, it was the loss of everything else, the life she had carefully built, the network of admiration she had surrounded herself with, the respect she once commanded, and I can see it in her eyes. She wanted to say something, an apology, maybe an explanation, but she didn't, because she knew I didn't care. Her words meant nothing now. They had meant nothing the moment she decided to betray me. I took the papers, nodded at the lawyer, stood up without another glance at her, and walked out of that office into a new life, one where I was free, one where I didn't have to second-guess every conversation, every late night, every secret look at a phone screen, one where I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already won. And Mira, well, I imagine she wakes up every day knowing that she was the one who did this to herself, that she had everything and threw it away for a cheap thrill, that she could have walked away clean if she had just been honest, but instead she got the worst punishment of all. Irrelevance. No one trusts her, no one believes her, no one sees her as anything other than a cautionary tale, and that is something she will have to live with for the rest of her life. So now I ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted her immediately? Would you have given her a chance to explain? Or would you have done what I did, let her believe she was winning until the very moment she lost everything? Bye-bye.